Hi everyone, welcome back to Liz Sews. So I saw this bra recently on Katie Makes, which is on Instagram, and I was absolutely in love with it, and so I decided I wanted to try to recreate it myself. So the first step was to gather the materials. I ordered some silk. I ordered it in really lovely dark green, which I'll pop a picture of what it's supposed to be here. And this is what I received. Like, it's still really pretty. It's obviously still silk. It feels like silk and it has the properties that I thought it was going to get, but it's just not quite the right color. So I spent the last couple of days just trying to over dye it to get something a little bit closer. Silk has an issue where silk doesn't pick up dye as easily as like a nylon or wool does, so that's sort of a problem. But I used a couple of Dharma Trading Company's acid dyes in teal blue, duckling yellow, and true black, trying to just tone this down a little bit. And I think I've gotten not exactly where I wanted it to be, but certainly just a little bit closer to my idealized look. So I'm gonna go ahead and use this over dyed version. I purchased a half yard, I cut it in half so that I could still use this if I needed to, but I think I'm gonna go ahead and use the one that I over dyed. So there's that. And then I also picked up some lace from AliExpress. This lace was really cheap. It was 99 cents, I think, for 2 yards. So we can't really complain about that. And it looks to be almost exactly what she has used in her original design. I really like how it looks kind of sheer against my skin. You don't really see it. It does seem to be like a bra tulle. It has stretch in one direction, but it seems pretty stable. And then you just have that embroidered design on the top. So those are going to be the two materials that I'm going to be using. And then when I was looking at patterns, I noticed two things about it. So first off, it seems to be sort of like an amalgamation of a diagonal cup seam with a vertical cup seam. So it starts out vertical through the apex, and then it sort of like veers off into the undercup. Or the underarm. So I kind of had the option. I could start with a diagonal seam like this and then cheat it in at the bottom, or I could start with a vertical seam and cheat it in at the top. So the other thing that I noticed about the pattern is that it seemed to be quite a tall cup. So I decided to go with the vertical and cheating in at the top because I already had a tall vertical seam pattern. So the starting pattern I worked with was the Annie and Myra Grace pattern, and here's what those two cup pieces look like. And this produces just a straight up vertical seam. So I have this example of an Annie and Myra's cup that's made up, and we can see that like that seam starts vertical at the bottom, moves up, and then it definitely goes straight into that neckline edge. So what I had to do is sort of cheat it out to the side. So I cut this pattern piece out in a cheap fabric like sheer cup lining. So I cut it out, made a cup, and then once the cup was made up, I went in with scissors and sort of cut along where I wanted the seam line to sort of be in the end, and then traced my pattern off of that. It took a couple of iterations going back and forth, but eventually I got something that I was happy with. And so here is my modded cup. So we can see, if we look at the outer cup piece, you can see that for sure we're definitely getting that sort of like swoop in so that I'm no longer getting the seam cutting through on the neckline. Now the seam cuts in on the underarm edge for here. And then this is going to be my new inner cup. And obviously we can tell that this one has a lot more material in it. So I have raised the neckline a little bit additional just because I thought that that would look closer to the gold pattern. But you can see how originally this cut piece would have ended here, and now we're extending up into the top. So I have one single lace edge that's going to fall along the neckline, and then that lace is going to continue sort of into that underarm seam. So with my pattern all figured out, I'm going to go ahead and cut out my pieces. Feels like I've been cutting out forever, but I'm finally done. So I have the two center front pieces cut out in lace. Then I have the outer cut pieces, the outer frame, and the bridge cut out in silk, and then the back band cut out in power net. In addition to all of these for the front of the bra, I've also cut all of those pieces out a second time in a sort of like my nude sheer cup lining that's going to stabilize everything, because this does have a little bit of stretch to it because it's a stretch silk, and the bra tulle might not be super stable. So now at least I have one more layer underneath it to make sure that it is nice and firm when they put tension on it. So I'm gonna thread my machine up with black thread, and I think I'm gonna use all black findings for this and get to sewing. The first step is gonna be my cup. For the cup, I'm gonna do the enclosed seam method. Obviously, that's my favorite all the time. So I have a sheer cup lining and a lace layer in my inner cup, and I'm gonna lay them on top of each other and then pin along that curved edge. The reason I'm pinning the lace first is because this lace is semi-see-through. So I want to make sure that all of my seam allowances are on the fabric side of the cup. If my seam allowances ended up on the lace side of the cup, then you would be able to see them and it's not as pretty. So now that I've got that pinned, I'm going to take my silk right sides together with my lace and pin that into place on top. And then my last step for pinning is to turn this over to the inside and pin my lining along the inside. I'm going to repeat this for the second cup, and then take this over to my machine and sew with a 1/4 inch stitch along the pinned edge. While I'm in pinning mode, I'm also going to do some pinning on my bottom band. I find this is one way that I tend to sew bras a little bit faster, is because I batch together like activities. So I do like a lot of pinning at once and then a lot of sewing at once. So I'm going to pin my silk layer of my frame to my back band. And then, of course, sandwich it with my lining. That way I get nice enclosed seams. And I'm also going to pin my lining and bridge together. So if I've done this right, I should have every single piece of my bra in the pinned pile, so I'm not leaving anybody out. That way I am maximizing my efficiency. So I'm going to sew the top of my bridge. I'm going to sew both of my back band pieces to my outer frame pieces, and I'm going to sew my 2 vertical cup seams. So I've now sewn everything I've prepared. I just sew in one long line without ever like stopping the needle in between. And I can just cut them apart. So now I need to do a lot of my top stitching. So on the cut pieces, the outer cut piece can now be folded out. And what we should have is lace and silk on one side and all lining on the interior, and the seam allowances encased in there, and they're all encased on the side of the silk so that it's not visible from the outside. So I'm going to open out both of my cups and top stitch them close to that original seam line. I'm also going to fold out my outer frame pieces and top stitch them along that original seam line. So for these two. And I am going to understitch on the bridge here, just on the lining side, to make sure that the lining doesn't roll to the outside. Now with that all done, I can go ahead and start assembling things. So for the frame, the first step I want to do is make sure that I have this folded edge looking perfect on the top of my bridge piece. So I have the insides on the insides and the outsides on the outsides. And then I want to attach this with the silk touching the silk onto the outer frame here. I leave this seam unencased, or I don't encase this seam, because it tends to be covered up by the bottom band elastic and the underwire channeling. So, I mean, there is a way to encase it, but I find that it's not necessary because this is something that doesn't get seen. So I'm quickly going to sew those down and top stitch them, and then I can set the cups in. So now that I have my frame and my cups together, I can go ahead and combine them, and then we have what looks like a bra. So I'm just going to take these cups, flip them down, and pin them along this curve, and then sew with a 1/4 inch with a straight stitch. So now I've applied the elastic along the bottom and the top edges. On the inside, you can see that I have just narrowly avoided sewing the underwire channeling. The reason I've done that is because I am going to flip this elastic over the top, and that's going to be what covers the underwire channeling after we put the wire in. So now I need to do the second pass of the bottom band elastic, and then after that's in place, then I can sew down the underwire channeling on top of it. So now the bottom band has been completely attached and the underwire casing goes over top of it. You can see right here where that bridge connected to the outer piece, none of that material is visible, which is why I didn't bother encasing the seam allowances. And here's what it looks from the right side. Now I can go ahead and put my wires in before finishing the top edge. Now that I have my wires in, I can go ahead and flip that elastic to the inside and secure it along the flat edge of the picot elastic. This completely covers up the end of the underwire channeling and finishes that connection point. Do make sure that when you're going over that underwire channeling, that the wire is pretty much out of the way. You don't want to break any needles. I think it's looking pretty good. The last steps are just to put on hook and eye and straps, and my bra is done. And here's the finished bra. Pretty happy with how it turned out. I think it looks very similar to the inspiration. Probably not exactly the same, but certainly close as I could get.